Good morning and welcome to the first of our MnDOT Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility webinars. My name is Elliot McFadden. If you've not had a chance to meet me, I am the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator at MnDOT. And wanted to give you a little bit of background before we get started with our first webinar and tell you a little bit more about this program and some other webinars that are going to be coming up. So the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Program is new at MnDOT. I started at MnDOT and helped launch the program in January. And part of the work that we're doing in addition to helping communities around the state find shared and identify shared mobility opportunities, we also want to increase general knowledge share and help people understand about all of the different kind of technologies and options that are out there. And so we're launching this webinar series today with that idea in mind. So you will see in the coming months, we'll be doing additional webinars. We have set a time for the second Wednesday of the month at 11 a.m. Normally that would have been our time this month, but that ended up being Veterans Day, so we pushed that back to this week. But the next one coming up will be on December 9th at 11 a.m. And you'll see that in the coming months. So if you're an invitee on this call, you will be receiving additional invitations until you ask me to remove, to get removed from the invitations. And you'll see the new webinars that are coming up. If you've got somebody on your staff who isn't on the invitee list and would like to be included, we want to make this free and available to anybody working in transit or transportation in Minnesota. So you can join in by sending me an email to elliot.mcfadden@state.mn.us and make sure you put 2 L's and 2 T's in Elliot to make sure that gets to me. And we'll be happy to include you in future versions of our webinars. Wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping. We are setting this up. This is our first time doing this on the Teams platform. And we are setting this up so that the participants are all going to be muted, except for the presenters during the presentations. We had over 50 people RSVP for this, so that can get a little unwieldy. But if you've got questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. We are planning on having about a 10 to 15 minute Q&A at the end. And at that time, we may ask you to unmute if we want you to elaborate a little bit more on your questions. As I mentioned before, we are recording this webinar, and the plan is to include a recorded version with closed captioning provided by Microsoft Teams with the copy of the slides that the presenters are going to present today. On the MnDOT Transit page, as an invitee, you will get a link to that. And after the meeting is over, I'll also be sending out a link for a little post-webinar survey. We want to make this really valuable and interesting and work for folks, and so I'll be asking for your feedback so we can make these future webinars work better. So with that, we will go ahead and jump into our first presenter. I've got Carl Fredlund from Mobility Data, and he is going to give us an overview of GTFS as a technology and help us understand a little bit more. So, Carl, I'm going to go ahead and stop presenting and let you take over.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see if we get this. Ooh, I'm not sure if I can be able to present the slides. It's Elliot, I think you said you had a copy of them handy.
Yeah, it was coming up for you.
It was coming up? Okay.
Yeah. Up now it's switched over. Now we can see up there. There you go.
Okay, cool. I've lost my dashboard, but if you all can hear me, then we're good.
Yeah, we can see your slides. Go ahead.
Perfect. So yeah, I'm Carl Fredlin. I'm the product manager for public transit at Mobility Data. Basically, that means that I prioritize and manage around public transit data in our organization. I'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. So basically, I want to go over what GTFS is first, because I think it's useful context for understanding what mobility data is as an organization. Then tell you about that, and then introduce GTFS Flex, which is an extension to GTFS for on-demand service, and quickly touch on GOFS, which is a more in-depth project that we're looking to start about on-demand transit services. So firstly, yeah, what is GTFS? So I'm sure some of you are already working with it, and others probably are getting acquainted. Basically, it's a general transit feed specification. So it's a data standard for transit passenger information. And it's the way that transit service providers are able to get their information into traveler-facing applications. So here is an example of just some data that Mankato has produced in GTFS, and then Google is ingesting that data that's in the format, and they're able to, then a user is able to go on there and plan a trip and find out how to get from A to B with the bus. So I'm not going to go into the details of how the specification works, because I think it's out of the scope for today. But on a high level, it's basically, the core of it is representing what you'd find on a schedule. So here's an example from Paris, but it would be the same thing, in any other community. And so all this information is represented in CSV files. So it's just the pieces of data that are structured in a certain way, separated by commas, and there's certain fields in that file, and then there's certain files that come together and are named a certain way, and that's how the data is created. So it's actually pretty simple, simplistic way of representing it, which makes it easier, especially if you have a smaller data set, to actually understand the data without needing to process it. So another important aspect of GTFS is that most of it's released as open data. So that means that agencies open up the data and release it for public use. So this allows different agencies to be linked together in traveler-facing applications. And it also, just having it out there, sitting there, lets people take it and work with it and innovate with it. There's several platforms out there for getting this data out into the world. One of those is run by our organization, which is called openmobilitydata.org. And these are all just places where the data feeds can be stored. So anybody who's looking, say, to make an app for getting around Minnesota could go there and find all the different data from all the different agencies. So here's a use case of what GTFS can actually solve. So I know you can't probably read the place names on here, but you might recognize this as a map of the North Shore of Lake Superior. So this is a use case that I've run across a couple times, is people trying to figure out how can you travel from Thunder Bay, Ontario to Duluth. So it's probably kind of a not a super common use case, but I think there's many, probably in the areas you work, there's probably many of these cases that are relatively complex, but theoretically could be solved if the traveler had access to information. So in this case, someone might take a city bus in Thunder Bay, and then there's a casino shuttle actually going across the border, at least when it's not COVID. And then they're able to take two different types of service run by Arrowhead, as well as city bus, DTA city bus, to complete a full journey door to door. And so if all that data is released as GTFS and ingested by an app, then they'd be able to go onto Google or whatever service it may be and actually find that it's possible to make that trip. Another few examples just for everyone to think about. So on the left here is a example of a bus company that has a advertisement on their wall for service to, amongst other places, Awatona in central Mexico. They're obviously not putting this on their wall for fun. They're doing it because there's demand to travel there. And so I think that just shows sort of some of the complex realities of the transportation landscape in Minnesota. And so if those companies, which is starting to happen, they're starting to come online more and more, be able to find all that information in a centralized place. And then on the other side of this slide is an example of a trip that someone planned on Apple Maps in East Grand Forks. And they're able to actually use the app in Spanish, if that's the language that they happen to be speaking, and get that information through the GTFS that Grand Forks has created and Apple has consuming. So GTFS is a community governed specification. So what that means is that the governance system is very open. The specification itself has an open source license, meaning anyone can use it. And the process of changing it is managed by a community online that's totally open. There's no need to become a member. Anyone who is just becoming involved with GTFS can go on there and raise concerns or suggest changes. And there's a process there that's consensus based for everyone to come together who's engaged in subject and vote on any changes. And so, yeah, that's sort of the place that we're at now with GTFS. It was started for fixed route service as a partnership between Google and TriMet in Portland. And since then, over the last decade and a bit more, people have realized that there's more and more needs for different types of information about transit. So one of the first big extension projects was for GTFS real time, which is describing the live positions of buses or service alerts, stuff like that. And then there's also sort of general extensions both to GTFS real time and to the core GTFS schedule information. And that's, so it can be anything such as describing accessibility information. So here on the picture, you can see that funky box with the different colors in it, which is actually a type of a QR code that one of our members called NaviLens created for people who are visually impaired to be able to get the same information from that sign through their phone as a seeing person could get. And so we have worked on projects, for instance, to extend GTFS to support text-to-speech with them. So here it's E23 Street, if you read it just as literal sort of pronunciation, but in reality, seeing person would process that as East 23rd Street. So helping create the fields in GTFS to describe that in a way that's more easy to understand. So that's basically a good segue to who Mobility Data is. So our organization has come into existence to help facilitate that process of expanding GTFS to meet additional cases and helping more folks adopt and get their GTFS out into the world. So the organization has its roots back with the Rocky Mountain Institute a few years ago, and it's really over the last year that year and a bit that the organization incorporated in Montreal, Canada as a nonprofit, and we've built up a staff pretty quickly through the pandemic mostly, and spread between Canada, the US, and France. I won't go into great detail about our mission and vision. I left these slides in here in case you want to reference them. The main thing is that our goal is to even the playing field between non-driving modes and other modes when it comes to information. So we're creating data standards to try and help facilitate that being easier to an easier environment to create. We're community-centered, are membership-based, and we're working on both improving the specification itself, creating tools that the market hasn't created to help in the adoption of GTFS and the dissemination of the information. And we're working to educate the community as well. Yeah, again, our governance is of our organization itself is membership driven. And in terms of principles, the most important thing to remember is that we're very focused on the traveler's experience. So rather than operational, really our primary approach is to design everything with the traveler in mind, really how are they getting from A to B. So one of the extensions that we've been working on is GTFS Flex. So this is one of those ways that we came together, brought the community together to try and think, okay, what is a need here that's not being met by the original GTFS that was designed for fixed route service? And so this was, it became apparent that there was a need to represent various types of on-demand service. So hail and ride along a fixed route, route deviation, and the concept of collecting passengers from an area to a station, or it could be kind of shopper's shuttle, something like that. As well, we realized that the booking systems are quite varied in terms of on-demand service. Along with the booking rules for it. And it was realized that there was sort of an opportunity, a big opportunity here, because there's a limited discovery in a lot of these services. People don't know if they exist. If they know they exist, they don't necessarily know what they can be used for. And also there seemed to be an opportunity in more and more on-demand services digitizing, but there was a risk in having some of the vendors coming in, trying to sort of build environments that were only going to sell their products, which isn't useful when you're trying to create an open ecosystem to see all the benefits that you saw before that GTFS has created. So version 1 was a project that was created as a FDA Mobility on Demand sandbox demo project with the Vermont Transit Agency and Tulare County in California. And so they had a simplistic way of representing their specific use cases in the standard, and that got into the Open Trip Planner, which is an application that's similar to Google Maps transit application. And they were able to put that up on their website to let people plan the trips there. So that's where mobility data came in. And we drafted the version 2, which systematized a lot of the features that were originally covered. And we also extended it to meet additional use cases. And so the result of that proposal is that the data is actually able to be represented for several different types of service. And it's currently been implemented. Here's a use case of a bus in Vermont that's stopping, that has a flag stop or sort of a hail and ride style anywhere along a certain stretch. And so here you can now plan your trip from anywhere along that route in Google Maps, where previously, instead of showing you that you could just take the bus from in front of your house, it told you, oh, you needed to go all the way down to the park and ride where there was, an official stop rather than a flag stop. And so that brings us to GeoFS, which is a new project I mentioned, where we're looking at what are the constraints of the work that's already been done in the GTFS Flex V2. A lot of different agencies and transit tech companies have come to us and said there's a need to go deeper with on-demand services. So stuff like showing the real-time live ability, allowing for booking, etc. So since that's out of the scope of we expect that to be a very large amount of work, and technically it's something that likely is going to need to be its own specification because it won't be able to represent those types of things in the simplistic way that GTFS is structured. Where the plan is to convene a working group at the beginning of next year. And that will be, looks like it's coming together quite well, actually. So we're trying to get a good mix of folks who are producing data, so agencies or vendors working for agencies, consumers, so the Google Transit, Apple Maps, transit apps of the world. And we definitely want to make sure we have public sector involved as well. And so bringing all those together all those folks together, and we're going to create then the project scope and roadmap and really define the needs there. So it's definitely something that we're excited to get more people involved in. And yeah, we'll see sort of what comes out of that based on the needs that are able to be defined by that group. So I hope that gave you a quick introduction to GTFS and what it can do and what the role of mobility data is in that process.
Thank you, Carl. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if folks have questions as they come up, if you want to put them in the chat box, you should have somewhere on your screen a little box with a chat icon. You can click in there and add a question. I will add, in addition, to let you know that MnDOT is a member of Mobility Data, so we are there representing Minnesota and your needs in the conversation about GTFS, and we are exploring ways that we might be able to work in this new project with GeoFS to see if we can help do some of that testing. So we're exploring that as well. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Matthew Barnes, and we also have Sarah Hackett from Oregon DOT. They have put together a presentation to talk a little bit more about, from the DOT's perspective, how they're using GTFS as a tool to help plan for better transit, and I think is a really great guide for us in Minnesota as we look to implement more of this kind of technology to see what they've done in Oregon with a similar sort of diverse set of different transportation players. So with that, let's see, Carl, if you want to stop your screen share, and yep, there we go. There is the Oregon presentation, so take it away, Matthew, I'm sorry.
Either way is good. Thanks, Elliot. Let's see. Can I control my slides? Yes. I'm going to talk a little bit about ODOT's work with GTFS. So it'll be sort of a short history, talking about how we got started and lingering a little bit on the analysis pieces of GTFS. And then I'll be covering some of the ground that you just heard about with GTFS Flex and GeoFS. In 2009, ODOT decided to start investing in GTFS, and one of our early choices was to bring a contractor on to help smaller agencies create and maintain GTFS. And in 2009, there wasn't a huge amount of awareness of GTFS, so it was kind of slow going initially. Today, 11 years later, we have close to 100% of our fixed route service in Oregon publishing GTFS data. There are a few exceptions, like some tourist-oriented services, but we're doing pretty well. One of the things we did to organize GTFS around the state is we have this landing page directory of GTFS feeds. This includes all the current feed locations around the state. Many of these feeds are hosted at our contractor, but others are at transit agency sites. We also take advantage of tools like Open Mobility Data's, I guess the old name was Transit Feeds, and also Transit Land. Those are both tools that aggregate feeds and allow others to get easy access to the feeds. And to some degree, there's some functionality to do operations on the feeds. The reason we got engaged with GTFS initially was the whole trip planning part. I mean, we thought that making our investment of $100,000 or so in consultant support a year was justified by the trip planning benefit we get statewide coming back. That's all I'm going to say about trip planning. Oopsie. So a couple of years after we got started with GTFS, it slowly dawned on us that there's another really powerful use case for GTFS, and that GTFS is actually a model of fixed route transit around the state. And can we take advantage of that model to help us better see and understand our statewide network? So the first place we went was to start to bring GTFS data into GIS systems, and so this is an early map. There's some big missing services on here. I think Greyhound's not represented. So this was a few years in, but we still had some kinks to iron out. We also ended up bringing in GTFS routes and stops as a layer in a larger Department of Transportation GIS-based system that allows non-GIS experts to layer different data sources together. And this also provides a resource for our highway staff. They're doing a highway project. They can come here and see what the stops are in the area, their transit stops are in the area they're doing work. So the next step was we wanted to take advantage of GTFS in richer ways than just by mapping. And so we worked with Oregon State University to build an open source tool that brings together GTFS and census data and lets us see relationships between transit and population, transit and employment, and transit and transit. Here's some examples of sort of the kinds of data that we have easy access to through TNext these days. So we have 58 feeds in Oregon as of today, representing about 69 transit agencies. Of those agencies, 27 operate only one route, so a lot of these services are pretty small. TriMet, the largest service, I think operates 93 routes, and it also operates about half of the service miles that happen in Oregon each year. And that's about a million miles of service a week or slightly above. And these are pre-COVID numbers, so things change in COVID. We know there are about 12,000 transit stops in Oregon. We know sort of silly statistics like about 1% of Oregon's geographic area is served by fixed route transit if you define service with a 0.5 mile radius around transit stops that's not duplicated area. As we were bringing together TNext, we stumbled across a project that's now called Remix. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Remix, but we were impressed enough with the product, became the first licensee, and we got a statewide license for Remix use. And this Remix is a quick prototyping tool that lets transit agencies plan new services or service changes in a really effective, efficient way and communicate those changes. If you don't know about it, I suggest you learn a little bit. This is a screenshot of TNext, and there's a certain amount of reporting that can be quickly done on a map. And in particular, we tend to use TNext for exploring areas of the state we're not super familiar with. We can see routes and stops, zoom in and out, look at the population and employment, Title VI characteristics, park and rides, all within the defined geographic area. Most of the value, though, we're getting comes from tabular reports. And this is a sort of a drop-down menu for those tabular reports. We have been zooming in on a couple different, or more than a couple different areas. One of the things we struggle with is how do we take advantage of TNext because it provides such a flood of data. And so one of our struggles is what's the important actionable data? What information can we use to make smarter investments in the statewide network, to make our policies have more sense, and to create a better connected, more useful statewide network? So here's some areas that we've been looking at recently. So spatial connection opportunities, TNext allows us to identify stops that are pretty close together but are not together. So for example, in an urban area, we might see that agency A, closest connection to agency B is 1.5 miles away. And so we create this list of close but not overlapping stops, and that tells us where we have opportunities to close those spatial gaps and create a better connected network. So that's one area of focus. Another area of focus, which is a little bit older for us, is key transit hubs. TNext allows us to see things like stop clusters served by multiple agencies. So in this case, looking at the state, there are about 41 stops or stop clusters served by 3 or more agencies. We see these as being really important to the connective tissue of the statewide transit network. And in particular, our discretionary grant programs prioritize investments at key transit hubs. And we found that the key transit hubs sometimes are well planned and well organized, and other times come together in a kind of a haphazard way. And so one of our goals is to raise awareness of these key connecting points. Service distribution is another area we're really interested in, and TNext lets us see in pretty good detail how much service is going to large urban areas, to smaller communities around the state, and to medium communities. Something that happened in Oregon that we're really pleased about is about 1.5 years ago, the state legislature created a bunch of new funding for us, and we transitioned from pushing about $50,000 a year out the door to about $150,000 a year. And one of our expectations was we were going to use TNext to see changes in the network as that money started to go into the system. Then COVID happened, so it becomes a much more complicated situation. This is an example of a tabular report. This is a transit hubs report. You can see this agency count column. We have a transit hub with 12 agencies, 8 agencies, 8 agencies, 7, 6, 5, so on and so forth. And so this is the basis for the key transit hubs information. And here's a map that shows our key transit hubs. And again, those are stop clusters with 3 or more transit agencies serving them. And so it's not just in the urban areas, although there's a concentration in the urban areas in this I-5 corridor. This graph gets at the amount and quality of service at different community scales. This represents about 80 urbanized areas and urban clusters across the state. And so each row is a size category. So there, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there might be 25 communities in the population range of 2,500 to 7,500. And in those communities together, if you look at the population served, and this is served in this case, I think was defined as 0.25 miles from a transit stop, 18% of the population is within 1/4 mile of 4 visits a day of transit service or more. If you go up to 8 visits a day, then you're dropping down to 11% of the population is served. 16 visits a day, 4%. 32 visits, 0, or some fraction slightly above 0. And so this lets you compare at different population community scales that level of service picture and percentage of the population as it changes. And this is, I guess, sort of what one might expect, but seeing it with real data behind it was really interesting for us. And one of the things we expect to do is watch this indicator and see how it changes over time as COVID clears up, as our new investment money goes down to the network. And at this point, we don't have enough time, enough history of information about this, and we don't really have benchmarks in terms of, is this level of service appropriate? Are we under-resourcing small communities? Are we over-resourcing small communities? But this information helps us begin to understand that and to understand it more clearly. This is a slide that, this is a slide that takes a look at the system service miles and population served at level of service at two time points, one in March, which was effectively pre-COVID, and one in July, which is mid-COVID. And if you look at the service mile indicators, and these are for different days of the week, and as you might expect, Wednesday has much more service than Saturday, which has more service than Sunday. But in terms of service miles, we saw a big, reasonable drop. These are daily miles. A pretty big drop in COVID times from pre-COVID. But interestingly enough, we saw an increase in population served at level of service. So our guess is that that's about the new money flowing into the system and lower frequency levels, but more coverage with transit systems. We recently released a transit network report that's based largely on data coming out of TNext. That's available. I can provide a link after this session. And a key transit hubs report. The key transit hubs report focuses in on those 40 or so key transit hubs, but goes a lot deeper and asks questions about things like what's the pedestrian environment like, what are the passenger amenities there, those kinds of things. So that kind of takes us up to sort of current days, except these new things we're just starting to get into. GTFS Ride is something we're really interested in because as nice as TNext is in allowing us to see the network, we have this big blind spot of not seeing a demand response service the same way we see fixed route service. So GTFS Ride data, we think over time will get us there. And so we've been investing in GTFS Ride data building. Oh, excuse me, I'm mixing up my terminologies. When I just said GTFS Ride, I meant GTFS Flex, and I'm going to bounce back to GTFS Ride and say GTFS Ride is a emerging data standard that is promoted by ODOT and Oregon State University that hangs ridership data on GTFS data. And so it makes this tight association between ridership and state of the network, which we think is really valuable. So GTFS Flex, again, is the demand response extension to GTFS. And this is where we're building data now. In terms of GTFS Ride, we're still working on building out the software ecosystem. We're also doing some work around extending GTFS Flex to include rider eligibility and service capabilities information. And I think that's scoped in as part of GOFS work as well. So we hope to collaborate with that process to make some progress there. So I think we've heard about GOFS a little bit. The last thing that we're working on is a revised version of TNext, taking advantage of what we learned with TNext and layering in the ride data and the flex data along with the fixed route information from GTFS. And thank you. I think I'm a little long in time.
Thank you, Matthew. Sarah has been helpful to post links to a lot of the resources that you mentioned in your presentation. So if folks want to take a look at the chat box, there are links to some of those reports and resources there as well.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to Marcy. Are you there, Marcy? Seeing you on the guest list.
Can you? Can you hear me now? I'm in. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Do you need me to present for you, or can you present?
Well, why don't you, and we'll save a moment there. And
Okay.
Fantastic, Elliot. Thank you, and thank
Sure,
you
no
everyone for
problem.
being flexible. A few of my slides will be a repeat. You know, the message that starts to come in and then hits your brain in a new way. We at National Rural Transit Assistance Program, as Elliot brings this up, support our agencies through FTA funding. It's managed by the Neponset Valley Transportation Management Association, and we have offices both in Washington, D.C. and in Massachusetts. Our primary focus is to make sure that agencies get the data that they need in terms of tools and support with technical assistance. The program that I specifically offer is the GTFS support for agencies, and we're going to run through some slides to show you how this data can actually be managed. And you could go to slide 4, that would be fine. Thank you. Our goal, what you see here, is a trip plan that is in the, thank you. The trip here goes 150 miles. It offers a rider a chance to get on and off multiple different systems. This is showing our standardized GTFS data at Apple Maps and how that display would work. The next screen, Elliot, thank you, is a display from Google. So we're just going to run through a few more images of what you've seen before. So next slide, please. And at Google Maps, they do some data integration. I'm not saying you move to the next slide, I'm sorry. Thank you. And often we have riders now that are in another language. And what Google and some of our other partners are offering is that the rider will see at their computer, on their home, on their phone, their home language, which could be Cambodian, Swahili, Greek, and no longer are we challenged as much by Title VI because riders can get the information they need in the language that they need. Next slide. So let's get under the hood to try to take away some of the difficulty or fear in how could this data get managed? How do we actually support people through National RTAP? Charlie Moore was kind enough as a GIS specialist at the Arrowhead Regional Development Commission to share some data that he'd already collected. So he sent me these points, which would now soon become bus stops. Next slide. And that data gets dropped into an Excel spreadsheet. There's a stop ID, there could be a public-facing stop code, little details, but most important, we have a name of a bus stop, the latitude and longitude. That's what builds the bus stop data of GTFS. Next slide. So we're going to have a conversation again about Arrowhead. I'm going to go south to Duluth, and on the left side you see they leave at 7 in the morning or 7:30, then they stop at the senior center. This is every third Friday. So how could that data actually be represented with the lat longs we just saw? And the next screen, please, in an Excel spreadsheet. So this Excel spreadsheet shows us the departure, which on the page before was, we're going to leave at 2 o'clock from the mall. And now the riders need to know, well, when will I actually get home? What time will you stop at the senior center? And we fill in all of that data. Some of that understood by the local community, but not known by everyone. So this data is available now in a standardized way so that a trip between Pine City and Duluth could soon become discoverable. Next slide. And yes, there are a few more details. And on the next slide, we see that we have to add the agency's phone number. I'm ready for the next. Oh, it's jumping on me. Someone else in the chat said things were a little fast and slow. There we go. So I'm now seeing the slide that I'm explaining with these colored tabs across the bottom, a system that we've developed to make it easy to know which kind of data goes into which cell of which part of the spreadsheet. The top half tells us some of the attributes of Arrowhead Transit, their phone number, their time zone. And the second half looks at the question of, well, we've got service every third Friday, how would we represent that? And so again, it should not be a difficulty for you to understand that it's just data. It gets standardized and organized, and we use our Excel spreadsheets. Now let's go to the next piece of the data that displays for the rider, which are the lines or the routes. And again, Charlie shared an already existing file for us. And to keep our pace moving here, I converted that into a tool that's online called My Maps. And now, without hundreds of hours of GIS experience, I and other partners can manage and develop and bring their route into their local community using My Maps. The next slide shows you what happens right now. If that arrowhead line between Pine City and Duluth are not available, riders go to Google Maps and they see a fine way to get there. They might have to wait about 20 minutes at the transfer center in the midst of some cold weather as we come into that season. But once we have data integrated and Arrowhead Lines displays, riders would see both options. When it's a Friday, the third Friday of the month, they would no longer say, well, I thought I saw a bus go by. Where is it going? Is it going where I want to go? Next slide. So GTFS tool, it's in Excel. You go to our no-cost toolkit builder at the website. You download the tools. And some agencies were finding that it was difficult to manage the upload and publishing of the data. They were fearful that someone from outside would come to their website to pick up the data. So National RTAP will host the data as well. Next slide, please. Because the data is just one way of organizing, we felt it would be helpful to have some videos. And so we have 2 to 4 minute videos in each of these different components. So if you just needed to remember how the calendar works, you don't have to watch 2 to 5 hours looking for your 2 minutes of information. And then we support it with real life, me, helping agencies move their data forward with whatever issues come up. I will add one more comment that we talked a little bit and heard from Matthew and Carl about GTFS Flex. That is a critical component for our tools that are needed in communities of Minnesota. We have come up with a workaround, we call it GTFS Flex Lite, where we can offer that discovery of the agency's system through our tools and toolkit. The last few slides I'd like to share, thank you, are a success story from rural Pennsylvania. Next slide. A staff person was assigned this project. She had never worked in GTFS data or at a transit agency. And as she got comfortable with it, things started to really roll. She reports that there are over 1,000 trips that they plan through the website, but we know agencies and riders would not need to come back to the agency in order to see how their data is accessible. It's now on their phone through various apps. Next slide. What they realized as an open records office, they want their data to be available. They can now do that with a click and no more phone calls asking for this kind of data. The next piece is what's most important to me, in that once an agency staff person was engaged in the project, because of the validation process that's required, the data starts to get more consistent between the website, what they're publishing at Google, the brochures, bus stops that were no longer in use, maybe the name had changed through the years. All of that starts to get cleaned up once you're down into the weeds of the GTFS experience. And I just have one more example that Chelsea Youngs explained to us about. This is our current process now. If we have a change in our brochure, we show them that route map display called a KML file. And Elliot, next slide. What we had before were just like you've had years ago, where you're taking out a piece of paper and marking things with an X. That was slow and not very helpful. We added a stop. It's a little bubble. Did they understand it? Probably not. So remind yourself that there's going to be a whole series of benefits here, more than we can show in 1 hour. So I'm available for questions, some contact information for myself on the last slide. And I appreciate you making National RTAP be part of this kickoff meeting today, Elliot. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. I appreciate you sharing that with us, and that's a great resource. Marcy has been very available for us at MnDOT and some of the other agencies that have been looking at GTFS. So I do recommend, if you're interested in this tool, to reach out to her. At this point, we have a few minutes left in the webinar, so if folks have any additional questions, you can put that in the chat box. It's been relatively quiet, so you can also unmute if you want, if that's a little easier. And we'd love to hear if folks have any questions for any of the presenters. I'm thinking we were maybe just so comprehensive. Okay, we've got a question here from Mark. Does Metro Transit Trip Planner use GTFS? I can answer that. They do have a feed, and that is going to be their base data source for trip planning. So yes. Also, if any folks have maybe use cases or things they're thinking about, how they might want to use this data, especially now that we have this new emerging standard for demand response with GTFS Flex, that could be a really powerful tool for a lot of our greater Minnesota systems. Does GTFS work just as well for rural transit as Metro Transit? So I'll leave that up to any of the presenters to talk about kind of the difference in presenting that information.
I'll jump in because National RTAP is the goal, has the goal of working with our rural communities. So perhaps part of your question is, well, what if we don't really have a schedule? How does GTFS work? And I'm not sure, and you can chat and add to this, but we have been able to work with rural communities with their once a week, once a month service and make sure that it's represented accurately, because that can be in a rural community, not urban, as well as this GTFS Flex Lite, where we can start to show, hey, there's a service, you need to call in, and then the conversation between the dispatch and the rider are exactly like they are today. The rider just needs to know who to call.
And yet maybe Carl, you might want to mention kind of the how the initial version of GTFS Flex works and maybe some of the new functionality that the 2.0 is helping to address.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually personally, kind of my personal opinion is GTFS is actually probably more important for rural service than it is for urban service, just because the discovery is harder in the first place. For a lot of people, it's not like you can just walk down to the light rail station like you can in the Twin Cities and look at the schedule, because if it's a flexible service, it's hard to know where even to start. So I think the discoverability that GTFS can offer is actually very important. So I think, yeah, the generally fixed route was the first approach. So the spec was originated with TriMet and Google. And so that was really a specific use case they were trying to solve. And so many things have grown out of that, and Flex is just one of them, but there's lots of other different extensions to GTFS around adding contact information and different fields. So I think at this point I think Marcy's done a great job of showing that there's a really pretty easy way to start representing a lot of the more rural service. And yeah, I think it's exciting to see more and more smaller agencies get involved. And one other thing that I think is interesting was touched quickly on the validation of data. And that's where there's actually a lot of work going on as well. So one of the challenges for the tech companies, for Apple and Google, is, well, is it really worth us putting this information about, that is only going to be a few thousand trips a year on our services? We need to make sure the data is accurate. We need to make sure it's structured correctly. And so we've been working with Apple and Google and a lot of other folks to improve the validation process. So both with an automated process of just running the data through a bunch of rules to make sure that everything is conform with what the specification says, and also in creating a process, a qualitative process for reviewing the data. So it's actually something that Metro Transit's given really helpful feedback in, a sort of, well, how do we make sure that whoever put together the information in that sheet make sure they name the route the right thing. So all those processes are coming together as a single one between all the players in the industry, really, at least the major ones, which is really exciting because it will make just that scalability much, much easier.
And I'd also like to address, we are doing some things at MnDOT and the Office of Transit Active Transportation to move this technology along. So we received an innovation grant from FTA to build a mobility as a service platform in southern Minnesota, around Rochester and Mankato. We have 7 transit agencies, a mix of fixed route and rural demand response, and we will be implementing GTFS, partnering with them to implement GTFS data feeds as a proof of concept to potentially support other agencies around the state in bringing this on board. And then we're also working with our RTCCs, our Regional Transportation Coordination Councils, to look at how we can use GTFS and GIS to create a planning tool, much like what Matthew presented, to be able to see where we have service and gaps in service and levels of service. And that's a project that we are starting to pilot in-house with some agencies around the state. So if that's something of interest, definitely let us know, and we'll keep you up to date with these additional resources that we're trying to make available to you at MnDOT. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up the webinar. I'm seeing one last question I will answer. So how are you encouraging non-public transit providers to submit data? So Jefferson Lines actually does publish a GTFS feed, but part of the work that we are doing in the Southern Minnesota project is looking at other kinds of providers, like Rochester City Lines as a private commuter bus service, looking at things like the general bike share feed, which is designed for bikes and scooters. There's now some talk about adding car share to that. How can we support the publishing of information like that to all the different providers in a market? So that work is being done. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank our guest speakers again, and really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. I'm hoping that this is useful for folks. As I said, we will make the recordings available online, and we'll get that information out to you once that's available so you can share with your colleagues. And if you have any other questions or interest, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Thanks so much.